Hello BookTube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. This is my wrap-up for Jane Austen July. So I'm going to talk about these books. And I'm going to talk about the movie Persuasion. At the beginning of the month, I make a gigantic pile of possibilities for Jane Austen July. And I basically said, as a main novel, I'm going to read Pride and Prejudice and I'm going to read non-fiction about Jane Austen. And it turns out that I did none of these things. The main novel that I read was Sense and Sensibility, and I did not read a single nonfiction. I read 3 books for the prompt, a retelling or a historical novel set at the time of Jane Austen. So, what are these books? The first one that I read was A Civil Contract by Georgette Eyre. This is a romance set during the Regency. Georgette Eyre is an author I discovered this year. I read her for the first time, I think it was in February, and I love her. This is the 5th book by her that I read, and it's the first one that disappoints me a little bit. The reason I'm disappointed is that the love story is not necessarily very satisfying. So we are dealing with, I guess, a realistic situation. The main character, the hero, is a viscount who needs money. He's in love with a girl that he's known basically all of his life, and he proposes. Is he asking for his hand? Basically, he knows the father of his loved one very much, so he confides in him and he asks him, I have money problems and all of that, so I would like to ask for your daughter's hand, but I can't really. And the father answers, I would not give you my daughter's hand even if you had money. I don't think you suit one another. But I know someone. So it's the father of the woman he loves who arranges a match. And it's very much an arranged marriage. So the girl that he finds is the only daughter of a very rich merchant. And the daughter, this rich daughter, is not very pretty. She is not accomplished. She doesn't play the piano. She doesn't paint. She's not particularly clever. She's not necessarily comfortable in society. She is really a very, very average girl. However, she has met the Viscount a couple of times. She kind of loves him. She kind of likes him. So she accepts the match, and himself, he talks to her a couple of times, and he decides that, okay, perhaps we'll suit one another. This is going to be an arranged marriage, and we'll just try to make each other comfortable. And the thing is that the only path to happiness for that poor girl is to erase herself. She does everything not to disappoint her husband. She does everything to try to please him. Everything that she does is calculated not to offend the husband. And meanwhile, the husband remains in love with the girl that he's known for all his life. He remains in love with that girl for basically the entire length of the book. It's only towards the very end that he realizes that this girl would not really make him happy. But that doesn't mean that he necessarily falls in love with his wife. So it is a somewhat unsatisfying romance because the true personality of the girl does not really come out. She erases herself to be loved, and that is kind of sad. And at the end, it's not really love. It's like friendship or companionship, and it's very, very disappointing in that sense. So it's the first Georgette Eyre that I did not quite like, and also it's quite long for the story it's trying to tell because the arranged marriage happens quite early on, and then for a very long time then we're just hanging out with the 2 characters who are learning to know each other but are not quite getting along, or they're doing their best. They're muddling through basically, and yeah, it's not the best. I wouldn't recommend, if you've never read Georgette Eyre, I wouldn't recommend starting with this one because it's not the best. The second book that I read for Jane Austen July was also somewhat of a disappointment. It is Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. This is a mystery set 6 years after Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy marry. So at first I kind of liked it. I liked it quite a bit. We meet again the characters of Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Bennet is now the mistress of Pemberley, and she is about to host a ball. And during her preparations, at some point she's interrupted by Lydia, her little sister, Lydia Wickham, who arrives unannounced and claiming that someone got killed. And when that happens, when Lydia says somebody has been killed, Mr. Darcy and some of his guests go into the woods and try to find the body, and they do find it, and they find someone over the body, and they bring everyone back to Pemberley, and then they go to the authorities. And then the authorities, of course, have to hold a coroner's inquest. So there's the coroner's inquest, they question everyone, and we once again go over all the circumstances that we've already seen when Lydia arrives and then Mr. Darcy goes into the forest and things like that. And then the coroner concludes that a murder did indeed happen and that in all likelihood it was committed by the person they found near the body. So it goes to trial. And then at the trial, once again, we go over all the circumstances that we have already been told twice. So there's no investigating, there's no sleuth in there, nobody's asking any questions, it's just really witness after witness, just repeating what they've said once or twice or perhaps 3 times. We learn nothing through all of these investigations. The solution happens, it comes to the light out of nowhere. It's some sort of deus ex machina that just happens like this. A letter arrives and ta-da, solution. It's odd. As a mystery, it doesn't really work. Hanging out with the characters of Pride and Prejudice, at first it worked a little bit and then it stops working because it's just too weird. And I will refer you to the review by Kim at middle of the book march. It's not so much a review as a rant. It is very entertaining and I basically agree with everything that she says. So this is very disappointing as a mystery and as a retelling, well, not a retelling, but a book in the world of Jane Austen. So it's disappointing on both aspects. The third book that I read was not a disappointment. It is the wonderful Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is set approximately during the time of Jane Austen. I didn't know that. I learned that from Claudia from the channel Spinster's Library, where she mentioned that Jane Eyre was technically a historical novel set a few decades before it was published. And I googled it just to make sure, and apparently it's true. I don't know how they come to that conclusion because there's no date mentioned. I guess there are a few events like a rebellion is mentioned, and I guess that can only be at a certain date or something. That's probably the clues that somebody at the time would have known that it was set in the early 1800s. I didn't know, but I took it for cash. It's set during the time of Jane Austen. It fits Jane Austen July. And I love that book. And the one regret that I have is that I had never read it before. I kind of wish I had read this when I was a teenager. I would have loved it even more. In contrast with Jane Austen, it is quite different in tone. This is not a comedy, it's a tragedy in many ways. The characters are always in very serious situations. They are always on the brink of unhappiness. Some are in the middle of it. There is a dark cloud hovering over the entire book. This is not a Jane Austen light, full of light and countryside novel. It's set in the countryside, but it's countryside where it rains a lot. So it's much more dramatic than a Jane Austen. And I can understand that at the time when Jane Eyre was published, if everyone at the time, well, if women at the time were expected to read novels like Jane Austen, Comedy of Manners and things like that, this was probably quite a shock to the system. Other than that, I don't know what to say about this book. It's a classic, and on the first reading of a classic, very often I have nothing to say. I am just in awe of the story, of the mastery of the characters, and I have nothing specific to bring to the conversation. So the only thing I can say is, if you've never read it, read Jane Eyre. The story is very good, the characters are very good, it's a page turner in many ways, so read it, it's really, really good. And finally, the last book that I read for Jane Austen July was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Finally, a book by Jane Austen. I read it in the last week of Jane Austen July. It was a buddy read with Ellie from My Cozy Chronicle. She suggested that at the last minute and I just jumped on the occasion because it's a really good book to read as a buddy read. And this was the second reading for me. I read it for the first time last year for Jane Austen July. And last year, I don't know to what I was comparing it, but when I read it, I was somewhat disappointed. I don't know by what, but there was something in the book that disappointed me. However, on rereading, I loved it. I just loved it so much. So all of these tabs that you can see are basically moments where I laughed, where I smiled, where I giggled, where I thought something was so funny. So the pink ones are just that, places where I laughed, I smiled, funny places. And the green ones are places where Marianne Dashwood, one of our heroines, is acting like a fool. Basically, they are all the places where I considered Marianne behaving like an exaggeration or like a heroine of a romantic novel. For example, I don't know if I can find it just spot on like this. It was, pretty sure it was at chapter 16 of volume 1. Chapter 15 of volume 1. So Willoughby has just left Marianne, and basically it's not clear whether he has dumped her or not, but she's heartbroken because she was expecting him to propose, and instead he just said, I have to leave for London. And so Eleanor is thinking of her sister. So Eleanor thought with the tenderest compassion of that violent sorrow which Marianne was in all probability not merely giving way to as a relief, but feeding and encouraging as a duty. So Marianne has such high ideals relating to her sentiments, to her feelings, that it's her duty to be heartbroken after her boyfriend leaves her. She is, of course, heartbroken. That is made clear throughout the book. And I think that's the one thing that makes Marianne a character for whom we feel compassion, as opposed to a character that we just laugh at. It's because her feelings are genuine. They are over the top, and they happen to match her ideals of the romantic heroine, but they are also genuine. And the second reason why Marianne is not a completely ridiculous character is that she is expected to grow out of them. She is just 16, and that is mentioned more than once in the book, that her feelings are not set forever, even though that she thinks that at 16 her feelings are forever. They are not forever. Her temperament can still change quite a bit. So it's a redeeming aspect of Marianne as a character. So that's why she's not a Mr. Collins, for example, or she's not, compared to another character in this book, she is not a Miss Anne Steele, who is absolutely ridiculous, speaking always of beaux and talking. And because Miss Steele is much older than Marianne, we have to understand that the way she behaves now will be the way she will behave for the rest of her life, as opposed to Marianne, who at 16 still can learn quite a bit and will probably learn to rein in her temper and her feelings and all of that. Basically, I read this book as a parody of a romantic of a romance that was very much in vogue at the time of Jane Austen. I have to admit that I was quite a bit influenced by Katie from Books and Things, because on the second day that I was reading this book, she released a video where she was talking about rereading Sense and Sensibility and saying how funny she thought it was. And I could only agree, because at that point I had read a few chapters and I had already started to tab all the places where I laughed, and because I didn't remember how funny it was. And it is really extremely funny. So I will second Katie and say that as a romance, perhaps there's something disappointing in Sense and Sensibility. Perhaps the male characters are not really what we hope for our two heroines. Because Edward, we don't really see him woo Eleanor, because all that happens very quickly at the beginning of the book, and we are just told that there's a connection between Eleanor and Edward, but we are never really shown how it happens. And as for Colonel Brandon and Marianne, well, the Colonel is twice the age of Marianne and perhaps more. So it's, in that sense, it's perhaps not exactly what we expect, because also we are expecting Marianne, if there's a match between Marianne and the Colonel, it will not be because Marianne will be outrageously in love with him. It will be because she is more reasonable in her feelings. So in that sense, the two love matches are perhaps a bit disappointing, but as a comedy, it is absolutely hilarious. Every secondary character in this book is just utterly ridiculous. The Dashwoods, John Dashwood and Fanny Dashwood. Fanny Dashwood's mother, Fanny Dashwood's younger brother, the Palmers, the Middletons, the Steeles, even Willoughby. They are all completely over the top, ridiculous characters, exaggerations of people that we might meet in real life. So it's really, really a comedy. I think if I was to do again my comedy ranking, in case you haven't seen it, I did a series of videos where I ranked Jane Austen's books according to various factors. And one of these videos, I ranked according to how funny they were. This one would go up in the ranking. It would definitely go up. I think it's giving Pride and Prejudice a run for its money. I don't know if it's the most fun, but I think I would put it in front of Emma now. Now I would put it at number 2. It is, I think, at least the second funniest, if not the funniest Jane Austen novels. It's hilarious. And from all these 4 books that I've read, well, not so much P.D. James, but there's something in common between these 3 books that I've noticed. So between Sense and Sensibility, Jane Eyre, and A Civil Contract. And the one thing in common that all of the heroines have is that they must learn to master, to tame their feelings. That is the one thing that we learn from all these books, is that having too many feelings is bad for you. In Jane Eyre, that is very much the reproach her aunt is giving her when she's very little. When she's 10 years old, Jane Eyre is a very good girl, but once in a while her temper explodes. And to her aunt, that means that Jane Eyre is deceitful. And Jane doesn't understand, how can I be deceitful? I may have faults, but deceit is not one of them. And the aunt answers that it's her temperament that makes her deceitful. In her aunt's mind, the fact that she has feelings makes a woman unreliable. And I think that is something that is still valid today. A woman with too many feelings is not trustworthy. A woman with too many feelings is not reasonable, is not rational. So women with feelings are not to be trusted. So in a way, or not to be trusted or not to be respected. The proper way to behave is to not show any feelings. And in here, it's the path to happiness is to not have too many feelings. So that is a bit of a sad realization that for a woman to be happy, feelings should not be fed. Feelings should be subdued. Feelings should be limited. Feelings should be very held in rein and be reasonable and all that. So I guess that's kind of a sad take from Jane Austen. But anyway, that's what I can see. Hello, this is Next Day Elizabeth. I realized that I forgot to give my impressions of Persuasion, the movie, the Netflix adaptation that came out in July. So here they are. I'm going to start by saying spoiler warning. I'm going to assume that you have read the book and that you have seen the movie and or just one of them, because the plot lines are quite the same. So here we go. I did not like the movie. I'm sure I'm not surprising you when I say that almost nobody liked it. So at first what happened is that I started to watch the movie, and after 30 minutes I stopped because I hated it so much. The character of Anne Elliot had nothing to do with the character of Anne Elliot in the movie. The tone was so different, and there were moments where I was cringing on behalf of Anne. So with these drunken moments when she's shouting Captain Wentworth's name just to grab his attention but then hide, that was ridiculous. And then the moment that made me stop watching the movie was when Anne Elliot just blurted out drunkenly during dinner in front of everyone that her brother-in-law proposed to her first. So that her brother-in-law, Charles Musgrove, asked her to marry him before he asked her younger sister. So that was such 100% cringe for me that I stopped watching the movie. And then I was pretty sure that I would not watch it again, that I would DNF. But a couple of days later, I changed my mind. I decided that I would give the movie a chance, that I would watch the movie on its own terms, that I would stop comparing the movie to the book, and that I would accept the character of Anne Elliot and any other character in the movie was not the character in the book, and basically that the tone of the movie was not the tone of the book. I was accepting that this movie was a piece of art, a work of art that was different than that of the book, that was independent. So I decided to judge them independently. So I watched again and completely, and I still did not like it. However, there were things that I could appreciate more. I liked, like everyone, the visuals. The scenery was stunning, the houses were stunning, most of the costumes were quite nice. There was a lot of beautiful things going on, and that was fun. I also liked the character of Mary Musgrove. She just stole the entire movie. She is hilarious. The actress who plays her, I should have checked her name, but I did not. I thought she was just wonderful, even though the words that she uses are a bit weird. This modernistic approach to dialogue was a bit weird, but I very, very much liked it. And that is pretty much it. I like the actors in general. I cannot really complain. They did what they could with what they had, because in some cases they really didn't have much. So that's the things that I liked. What I didn't like the character of Anne Elliot. Even if I'm not comparing to the book, even if I just accept that this character is a new character, I did not like her. I failed to see why a man like Captain Wentworth would fall in love with her, because that character is self-centered, quite mean to her family. She is a bit weird with her rabbit. She clearly has an alcohol problem. She spent 8 years moping because her heart was broken. I can understand a heartbreak, but 8 years for a decision that was yours. I mean, at some point, get over yourself. So I did not like that character. And also, I failed to see why Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth were in love. It's not explained at all in that movie. It's just said that 8 years ago, they almost got married and that they loved each other very much, but we don't know why. That is never explained. The only reason we know there's love in there is because Anne Elliot keeps crying all the time. That's it. That's the only reason we know there was love, but we don't really know why. So I thought that was not really well done. And the thing that I hated the most was the fact that every character said very clearly where they were. There was no mystery in there. We know perfectly well that Anne Elliot is completely in love with Captain Wentworth, so there's no mystery in there. And a bit further on about at the halfway point, I think, we have seen Captain Wentworth flirt with Louisa Musgrove. And then when Louisa has her accident and Captain Wentworth is desperate, we know exactly why he's desperate. It's not because his loved one is sick. It's because he doesn't love her and he feels responsible and he's going to be stuck with the girl because it's his fault. The girl fell and had the accident and he feels responsible, and the only way, his duty is to marry the girl. So that's why he's sad. So at that point, we know perfectly well that Anne Elliot loves Captain Wentworth, that Captain Wentworth loves Anne Elliot, and they will not do anything about it because both of them have made their position quite clear that they cannot marry one another. And then we go to Bath, and then there's this character of Mr. Elliot, played by Henry Golding. And once again, we know exactly why he is there. He makes no mystery of his presence. He's there to separate Mrs. Clay from Sir Walter Elliot to protect his inheritance. And the character of Anne just doesn't mind at all. So that is also another aspect of her character that is not very savory. She doesn't mind this greedy person who appears to be looking out only for his self-interest. So anyway, so we know exactly where that character stands. And then he tells Captain Wentworth basically that he intends to marry Anne. He calls her my Anne in front of him, and he behaves like a fiance basically. So Captain Wentworth, even though at that point he knows he's not going to have to marry Julia Musgrove, not Julia, Louisa Musgrove, he thinks that Anne is engaged to someone else with good reason. So again, there's no mystery. There's nothing unexplained in the behavior of the characters. Everything is just blurted out. It's out in the open, and it's just, it's not interesting. So that's my main criticism of the movie. The tension is not there. It's just turned into cringeworthy moments, and it's just not interesting because there's no mystery in there. So that's it. That's what I thought of the movie. And back to the regular footage. And that video is long enough, so I'm going to leave it here as my July wrap-up for Jane Austen July. I read other books in July, but I will talk about them in a different video because this one is long enough. Let me know in the comments if you've read any books for Jane Austen July. How did your Jane Austen July go? And thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!